celebrating 10 years of possibility. Pilot Flying J and Halloran Hilton Hill present Anything is Possible. Today's guest, Mayor Madeline Rogero.
Welcome back to Anything is Possible. This is part 2 of my interview with Knoxville's Mayor Madeline Rogero. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And we wore the same thing. All right, so now we want to move. Last week, as we started your story, we talked about growing up in Florida and Ohio. We heard you sing. If you didn't see her sing, I would go to our website and check out her singing on the show. I think this is your debut, your TV debut in Knoxville as a singer.
I don't think any record companies are going to be.
But now I wanted to move into how you came into public life. You have a family. You have children, you have a husband. Tell me about your family, because I think after you finished college, it was getting involved in something in your community that kind of tipped the first domino. But maybe introduce us to your family first.
Right. Well, I have 2 children and 3 stepchildren. My son, Damien, is a professor at VCU in Richmond, Virginia. He's got a PhD in planning, city planning.
Wow.
So I have a master's, and he took it the next level. My daughter lives here in Knoxville with my grandkids, and she has a master's in social work, and she's the executive director of the Lisa Ross Birth and Women's Center, which is a birthing center here in town, a wonderful organization. And 3 stepchildren. The oldest is Meg. She is an engineer, civil engineer with environmental cleanups in Atlanta, Georgia. Daughter Meg, Joan, who is an architect, got her degree here in Knoxville. And then Jacob is the youngest, and he just finished Pellissippi and is looking towards going to finish his next 2 years.
So I just need to ask this question while I'm right here, while it's in my mind. You brought me some honey. Mm-hmm. Can I ask you about the bees before we get further? I know this is not
Certainly,
even connected
and
to
then
the
I could
pad.
talk about my husband, because I didn't mention my husband in all of this, right?
So you brought me some honey, and you said, I made this honey.
Yeah. Well, our bees made the honey.
The bees made the honey.
Right. I went to Costa Rica about 6 years ago. When I came back, we were beekeepers. My husband and Jacob had gotten into it while I was gone. But it's a wonderful, I say hobby because we're not in it for the commercial. Some people are commercial beekeepers. But I got into it with them as well, and went to some classes about it, and there's a Knox County Beekeepers Association. My husband, with the politics and such, my husband's been much more active in all of this than I have. But just a couple weekends ago, we went out and got in our bee suits and checked on the bees. But we have 2 hives, and if you treat them right and basically let them do their job, they will produce a lot of honey for you.
All right, so now, you go to college where?
Well, I started out at Temple University in Philadelphia. I wanted to move away from home and go to the big city, and I did that for a year. It was a wonderful experience, but it was really a financial strain being an out-of-town student. So I went back to Ohio for my 2nd and 3rd years. I went to Ohio State. I actually took a year off between 2nd and 3rd to work and become financially independent and just be on my own, but went back and finished my 3rd year of Ohio State. And then I left again because I decided to work with the farm workers and Cesar Chavez and farm workers. They were some of the lowest paid workers. They pick our foods and pick the produce that we eat. And I was drawn to that mission.
You said they taught you something about possibility too. There was a phrase you would hear them say.
They had an expression called "si se puede" in Spanish, and it means yes, it can be done. And it was an expression that they always used, "si se puede." It gave them hope. It said, you know, there's possibility. We can get better wages. We can get better conditions to work in. Our kids can go to school. Our kids don't have to work. So "si se puede" is the phrase that I learned in my early 20s, and it's something that has stuck with me all my life.
Wow. So you go out and you work with the farm workers. You do 2 years at the Ohio State University. Mm-hmm. Where'd you finish?
I finished at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina.
Wow.
Which is a great school. My husband and I were in Greenville, and when we left the farm workers, we ended up in Greenville. And so it was a wonderful Southern Baptist school, And I was older than many of the students because took me 9 years to get my undergraduate degree because of work and what I had done. So but it was a great experience, had an excellent faculty there.
What followed that?
Well, then we moved to Knoxville in 1980. And I had, I guess, a 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old when we moved. And so I was home for a while with the kids. And then I started working actually for a local field office of a national foundation that worked with a lot of community-based groups that were trying to improve their communities. And so I did that, and then I later went to UT to get a graduate degree in planning and urban planning. And again, I took the long route because of the kids and work. It took me 5 years to do that.
Now, you told me in a previous conversation that something happened in your neighborhood. They were doing something, and that's when you really stepped into being politically active.
I came home from work one day, and there was a flyer in the mailbox. I was living in Northwest Knoxville on Deer Creek Drive, and it was right before the World's Fair. I guess this was in '81, and there was a flyer that said, basically called all the neighbors together for a public meeting because there was a temporary travel trailer park that was going to be put on some property that is now the Victor Ashe Park. But it was a farm at the time, and it was on our narrow road, Ball Camp Pike. Our kids walked, or some kids walked or rode their bikes to the ball fields, and it was a very dangerous place to have big travel trailers coming in for the overnight parking. So I got involved with my neighbors, and it was a zoning issue. I knew nothing about zoning at the time, so I went down to the MPC and started talking to one of the staff members there. He explained it all. Neighbors, we all organized together and went to the Metropolitan Planning Commission and then to City Council, and we ended up getting it stopped. And that's when I first learned about planning. And I really liked it. I enjoyed what it was about, and decided that I would go and seek a master's degree in planning.
As you were telling that story, what my mind went back to was you said that your father would be working on cars and he would say, hand me the tool, hand me a tool. And this is, for me, this was just my quick takeaway. You're used to seeing somebody fix something, and you know there's a tool for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
yeah.
Never thought of it that way. But yeah.
And I never had, just before just sitting here hearing you say that, but I'm looking at you, you've got this situation in your community, you need to go learn the issue so you can figure out the tool to fix it. I mean, that's what engineers and people like that do. They have an issue and they fix it.
Neighborhood associations, they're all about organizing together and figuring out how to fix something.
Wow.
Yeah.
We'll be back with more in just a moment.
Possibility powered by Pilot Flying J, Covenant Health, Home Federal, and the Knoxville News Sentinel. Coming up.
I still would not have run for county commission if I hadn't gotten a call from somebody saying, I wish you would consider this. I think you could do it. And my first reaction, you might be surprised, but my first reaction was, I don't think I'm qualified.
Welcome back to Anything Is Possible. This is Madeline Rogero. She is the mayor of the city of Knoxville, first female mayor of our city. Thank you for spending this extended time with us to let us get to know you a little bit better and get to know the possibility person that you are.
Thank you.
It's one thing to say, as a community, let me be involved in the things that make our lives better. Let me serve. Let me take on the issues of the day, a la the nun at your school that said, okay, close the book, let's deal with what the real issue is. That's a world away from mayor, right? There are many, many people who are active in their neighborhood groups. They work on issues that are in their neighborhood, but it kind of stops there. Why didn't you stop, and what was next after that?
Well, actually, the reason why I got into politics is that somebody asked me to. You know, I was very involved as the first 10 years that I lived here. I was very engaged in neighborhoods. I wrote my thesis about, well, actually, I wrote my thesis about civic leadership and participation. And that was that came out in 1987, I think it was. And was just involved in a lot of things in my kids' schools and started PTAs and things like that. But I still would not have run for county commission if I hadn't gotten a call from somebody saying, I wish you would consider this. I think you could do it. And my first reaction, you might be surprised, but my first reaction was, I don't think I'm qualified, because I didn't really know what county commission did so much, because I'd followed city council a lot more, and I just didn't think that I could run and win. There was somebody who had been in office for 24 years, and but I was assured. They said, no, look into it. I think you'll realize you are qualified for the job. So I started talking to friends and investigating who was there and what had happened, and just kind of get all that information. And my friend said, yeah, go for it, we'll support you. And so on the last day that I could actually file, I filed my papers and I was in.
I don't perceive that you didn't think you were qualified. I think you have a commitment to competence. And I think you wanted to know, can I be competent in whatever this is in front of me? I mean, that's the thing that I notice about you. And I notice that about possibility people. They want to know, okay, if I step into the fray, can I do the job well, and can I make a difference? So what was it that you discovered that let you know you were qualified and competent, and then why did you want to do it?
As I looked into it, and I knew that the person who had been in there had been there a long time, and a lot of us really didn't know who he was, because he hadn't been that involved in what was going on in the schools. Now, he'd been there a long time, and our city schools had become county schools. They had merged just a few years prior to that. The county had tried to put a mass burn incinerator in North Knoxville, where I was living, and so all of a sudden, we who live in the city in North Knoxville started thinking, wow, the county's really impacting our life in a lot of ways. And so as I looked into it, I realized that my background in terms of planning and being in the neighborhoods and involved with my kids' schools, that I did have the experience, the knowledge to make a difference on county commission, or at least I thought I had an opportunity to do that. And so, I mean, I still had doubts when I filed, I have to be honest. But we started the campaign, and those 10 years of being in Knoxville and getting to know many people, both in my neighborhood. My kids played the Baby Falcon T-ball and on up all through high school. So I knew for almost 10 years I'd been at the ball fields, quite a bit, meeting a lot of people. And I was involved. I'd met people through my jobs, through my education at UT, through the League of Women Voters and other organizations that I'd been a part of. So I realized that I had a vast network. And so because when you run for office, you ask the people in your district to vote for you, but you also have to raise money from throughout the county, really.
Right.
So I realized I had a vast network that could possibly help me win. And so we jumped into it. And I really wasn't sure that I would win. I thought I might not be able to. My young daughter, was very confident in the end. She said, Mom, you're going to win. She was 11, I think, at the time. I said, well, honey, I may not win, because I didn't want her to be so disappointed. She had helped me a lot in the campaign. She was in the campaign office every day. And she said, no, Mom, you're going to win. And I said, well, why do you think so? And with all seriousness, she said, you have worked too hard not to win.
Wow.
Yeah, she was very confident, more confident than I was.
More in a moment.
Coming up.
I think Bill and I both felt that you run a hard campaign, but when it's over, whoever wins, you get behind them.
Our guest on Anything Is Possible this week is Mayor Madeline Rogero. By the way, this interview was done in 2 parts. You're watching part 2. Part 1 is at our website. I hope you'll go back and watch all of this, a delightful story about her life bringing her to this moment. County Commission, you get elected, but you are mayor. How'd you get from County Commission to mayor?
Well, I served for 8 years on County Commission, was elected twice, and after the second term, I chose to not run again. The term limits had passed, but they had not yet been enforced by the Supreme Court of the state. But I decided to not run again. And I had just started working with Dolly Parton's foundation, and you know, it was a lot of other things. I always felt that public service is something that all of us should think about doing at some point in our life, but there are a lot of good people who can serve. So as much as I enjoyed it, I was ready to go back to focusing just on a career rather than trying to juggle both. But I left myself open to running for something in the future. I thought about running for county executive a few years later, but then decided in 2003 to run for mayor because I really enjoy local issues, city issues, and that's when I jumped in to do that. Of course, Bill Haslam was in, and several other people. And
that was the most interesting thing because in that run for mayor, you did not win.
That's right.
All right, he won, and then
I
you
came
went
close.
to work. You came really close, but then you went to work for him.
3 years later.
And that was amazing. Talk about that.
Right. Well, I think Bill and I both felt that you run a hard campaign, but when it's over, whoever wins, you get behind them. Because it's all about, to me, running and serving is all about building community and not tearing it apart. And you see a lot of campaigns that you end up with a lot of bad feelings and the community is torn apart due to the nature of the campaign. So we had a good, hard-fought campaign. A lot of issues were raised. And in the end, voters supported Bill. So I wanted him to be successful. He was very gracious. I always say he was a gracious winner. I was a gracious loser. We immediately started talking to one another. We'd get together, and he was great about asking my advice. And often when I saw him making decisions, I'd think, now what would I do? You know, and I never was critical of him because I always wondered, well, that's a tough decision to make. How would I have handled it? So So we had a good relationship. Still, I was a little surprised 3 years later when he called and asked me to be his community development director. And it was a point in, when I was involved, I had just completed a major project with Capital One Financial Corporation. I was doing some consulting with their corporate affairs office, community affairs office. And so it was a good time for me, and he asked me to come on board, and I did. And it was a big challenge because that department had gone through a lot of major changes. And I had to pull together what had become a dysfunctional team into a strong working team, and we did. We had great staff, and we had some open positions, brought in some new folks as well, and I loved the work. I loved working with Bill Haslam, with Larry Martin, Bill Lyons, the whole team there, and my community development department. So it was a great experience, not only just that job, but I also had a real interest in how all of city government worked because I knew that I wasn't going to run against Bill during for his second term, but that I wanted to leave the possibilities open when he was term limited and could no longer run again. So I did my job as community development director, but I also learned a lot about the city, met a lot of the people, and that certainly helped me when I decided to run for mayor.
Love your optimism, love the engineer in you. That wants to solve the problem, that wants to fix the situation.
My husband's an engineer. He'll be surprised that you, that you see engineering in me. That's good.
If we just take the story the way that the narrative is played out today, it would seem like you've had this charmed life and boom, you're here. Have you had anything that you had to overcome, anything you had to push through? Are you just this relentlessly upbeat? If not, what are some of the toughest things, or what's the toughest thing you've had to push through? And kind of coach us and teach us about leadership and possibility as we close.
Well, as a county commissioner, we had a lot of tough issues to deal with. You may recall the whole issue of desegregation of our schools. Here we were in the early 90s, and the Office of Civil Rights had said, you know what, our schools had merged, but a few years earlier, 3 years earlier, I think, but there were a lot of inequalities there. And that was a tough fight because we had to look at closing some schools and investing significant dollars into upgrading others. And there was a lot of dissension about that. And I don't think it was a dissension so much about equalizing schools, but it was about the process that you go through.
Yeah.
You know, so tough decisions. And that's where I really saw that, as I said earlier, good people can disagree, and that because we disagree with one another, we don't need to demonize each other. We need to figure out how to work together to build community. that was one of the toughest political issues I think we dealt with.
Personal? Anything you had to
Well,
push
personal. Well, you know, I mentioned I'm in a blended family. I went through a divorce, and that's always a really hard thing to do on a personal level. But my husband and I, we remain friends today. We always worked very well for the kids. And a lot of people didn't realize we were divorced when we would go to ball games and sit together in the school auditorium, because we wanted to both be there for our kids.
Wow.
And so we've been able to reach a good balance on that, and not, you know, there's your ups and downs and you're dealing with that, but that's a hard thing, I think, because of the family.
There's probably a little girl and a little boy watching. There's somebody in college, a man or young man, young woman watching, and they're taking a cue today. They're trying to figure out what's possible, and I'd love for you to give them some advice. You need to hand them a tool, if you will, so they can kind of fix their life or engineer their life. What's the best advice you could give to a young woman or a young man about making things possible in their life? What have you learned about that?
There's a book, The Art of Possibility. Have you not read about
No,
that?
I haven't.
Oh, I'll have to
I'll
share that
get
with
that,
you.
yeah.
And I read it several years ago, and I just pulled it out again to refresh myself based on this interview. And it talks about there's always a set of circumstances of what you're dealing with. And the way you frame what those circumstances are determines whether you have a positive or a negative outlook. You know, the circumstances themselves aren't necessarily positive or negative. It's really how we think about them.
Wow.
And that's why some people can take the exact same circumstance. We talk about a glass being half full or glass being half empty. Some people, they walk around and their glass is always half empty. They always frame things in a negative way. You know, I've been blessed to frame things in a positive way. And so if there's an opportunity, if there's a problem, there's got to be a way out of that.
Wow.
You know, there's got to be a positive way to deal with this. And I would just encourage people to look for that positive way of working around this set of circumstances.
Wow, I love this. As you were saying that, I just thought this for the first time. To a thirsty man, if the glass is half full, it's full to him.
It's got some water in there.
Yeah, because it's way more than he had. Madeline Rogero, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.